The lie Louise Harper told when she stepped off the stage in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878 was a small one by the standards of the frontier, but it had weight enough to reshape the entire course of her life. She had said she was a widow. She stood on the packed earth street with a single leather trunk at her feet, dust rising around the hem of her dark blue traveling dress, and she had told the woman who came to greet her, a round-faced, cheerful postmistress named Mrs. Della Pratt, that her husband had died of fever outside of St. Louis 3 months prior, and that she had come west to start fresh. She had practiced the words on the 3-day journey, pressing her lips together in the rattling dark of the stagecoach until they came out smooth and even, without the tremble that the truth would have caused. The truth was considerably messier. The truth involved a man named Gerald Ashworth, a house in Cincinnati, a pair of legal documents she had tucked into the lining of her trunk, and a bruise on her left wrist that had only just turned from purple to a faded, sickly yellow in the week before she boarded the stage. She was 26 years old, a divorcee in a time and a country that did not easily forgive women that word, and she had come to Caldwell, Kansas, to teach school. The Caldwell schoolhouse was a raw lumber building at the edge of the town proper, not yet fully chinking-filled against the wind, with 4 rows of benches and a cast-iron stove that required coaxing every single morning. Louise threw herself into it with the kind of ferocious, grateful energy that only a woman who has escaped something terrible can manage. She organized the 22 children by age and ability rather than by the whims of whatever parent brought them in. She sent away to Wichita for readers and arithmetic primers. She hung a map of the United States on the wall beside the blackboard and pointed to Kansas every morning, telling the children that where they stood was the very center of a nation that was still becoming itself, that they were not at the edge of anything, they were at the heart of it. The children loved her almost immediately. The adults took slightly longer. Della Pratt was the first to openly embrace her, which helped considerably, since Della's husband ran the general store and Della herself was the living spine of every piece of social information that moved through the town. If Della Pratt called Louise Harper a fine woman and a credit to the school board's decision, then Louise Harper was a fine woman and a credit to the school board's decision, and that was more or less the end of the conversation for most of Caldwell. Still, Louise was careful. She wore plain dresses in gray and brown during the week and kept her dark hair pinned firmly back. She smiled at parents during pickup without giving them anything personal to chew on. She was pleasant and capable and just slightly opaque, and she told herself that it was wisdom and not cowardice, and most mornings she almost believed it. The first time she saw Clark Carver, he was standing in the street outside the feed merchant's with a horse that did not want to be tied to the hitching post. She was walking from the schoolhouse to Della's store to pick up a box of chalk that had arrived on the morning wagon, and she paused on the raised boardwalk to watch because the scene was genuinely compelling. The horse, a tall gray roan with a dark mane, and the general opinion of the universe that you could read clearly in its black eyes, had planted all 4 feet in a wide, immovable stance, and was refusing to be moved by anything less than an act of Congress. The man holding the lead line was tall himself, broad across the shoulders, wearing a worn canvas duster and a hat that had seen better decades. He was not cursing, which Louise noticed. He was not yanking the rope or striking the animal. He was simply standing there, one boot forward in the dust, speaking in a low, even voice that she could not hear from the distance of the boardwalk. And after perhaps 2 full minutes of this, the horse blew a great disgusted breath through its nostrils, took 3 steps forward of its own apparent decision, and allowed itself to be tied. The man patted the animal's neck once firmly, and then he looked up and caught Louise watching him. She felt the color move into her face and she looked away and kept walking, and that was the end of it for that day. She learned his name from Della, who was constitutionally incapable of letting any person appear in a story without a full accounting. "That's Clark Carver," Della said, cutting the string on the chalk box with a small knife she kept behind the counter. "Runs the Carver spread about 6 miles northeast of town. His father started it. Old Horace Carver came out from Missouri in '68. Horace passed 2 winters ago, left Clark the whole operation. It's a good-sized place, mostly cattle, but he's been experimenting with wheat on the lower acres. Some folks think that's a fool notion, but I think it shows character to try a new thing." She paused. "He's 29. Never married, though not for lack of trying on the part of certain mothers in this county." She gave Louise a look that was almost professionally innocent. "I was only watching because of the horse," Louise said. "Of course you were," Della said, and handed her the chalk. The second time Louise saw Clark Carver was at the May social, which the town held in the open space behind the church, with paper lanterns strung between poles and a fiddle player named Amos Birch, who could play 3 songs extremely well and 3 others well enough that nobody complained. The social was the sort of community event that was genuinely mandatory if you were a new resident who wished to remain in good standing. And so Louise went, in her best dress, a deep green wool with ivory buttons at the cuffs, and she stood near the punch bowl with Della and listened to Della explain to her in some detail the provenance and general character of most of the people present. Clark Carver arrived late, which Della noted with satisfaction, saying it was exactly like him, always finishing some piece of work on the ranch before he would let himself come to anything social. He came with a neighboring rancher named Pete Alderman and Pete's wife, and he had traded his canvas duster for a clean dark coat that fit his shoulders well, and he had clearly made an effort with his appearance that his hat, still the battered one, slightly undermined. He spotted Louise from across the space, and she saw the exact moment of recognition on his face, not the polite, measured kind that a man uses on a stranger, but the sharper kind that means the person has been noticed and filed away previously. She looked back at him with what she hoped was a calm and neutral expression, and then she turned back to Della and said, "Now tell me about the Aldermans." And Della, always happy to tell someone about anyone, obliged. It was Pete Alderman who actually introduced them, steering Clark over during a lull in the music with the cheerful aggression of a man who has had 2 cups of punch and is feeling benevolent about the universe. "Clark, this here is Miss Harper, the new school teacher. Miss Harper, Clark Carver, best rancher in this county if you don't count old Jeb Morrison. And Jeb would tell you himself that Clark's the better man, so it doesn't count as boasting." Clark Carver took off his hat, and he had dark brown hair that was a little too long at the collar and eyes that were the particular pale gray-green color of sage, and he said, "Miss Harper, I've heard good things about what you're doing with the school." "From whom?" Louise asked, because she was genuinely curious and because she had learned that the best defense against nervousness was a direct question. He smiled at that, a slight, pulled-corner smile. "My neighbor's boy, Tommy Hatch. He told his father last week that he could now read the newspaper on his own, and his father told me, and I told him it was the best news I'd heard since the rain came in March." "Tommy works hard," Louise said. "He's going to go far if someone keeps encouraging him. His father thinks the same, though his father also thinks the boy ought to be on the ranch full-time by September, which I'm hoping someone might gently talk him out of." Louise looked at him steadily. "Is that a request?" He looked back at her with those sage-green eyes, and there was something in his expression that was careful and honest at the same time. "It might be," he said. The fiddle started up again, and Pete Alderman drifted toward his wife, and Louise found herself standing beside Clark Carver through 2 full songs, not dancing, just talking, first about Tommy Hatch and the ranching family's complicated relationship with schooling, and then about the school building itself, and whether the town council was going to approve the budget for proper window glass before next winter. And then, before she quite realized how they had gotten there, about Missouri, which was where he had grown up and where she had lived for a year before Cincinnati. She did not talk about Cincinnati. But she talked about the Missouri River in the early mornings and the particular smell of river mud and green willow. And he listened in a way that men who are genuinely interested listen, not waiting for their turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said. When the social ended and the lanterns were being taken down, he walked her the 2 blocks to the boarding house where she rented a room from a woman named Mrs. Connolly, and at the door he said, "It was a pleasure, Miss Harper," and put his hat back on, and that was all. She stood on the front step after he had gone, and she pressed one hand flat against the door frame, and she told herself firmly that she had not come to Caldwell for anything of this sort, and that a schoolteacher's reputation was a fragile thing, and that she was a woman with a lie in her past and a legal document in her trunk, and no business looking at a rancher's green eyes like they were the first kind thing she'd seen in years. All of which was true. None of which helped very much with the way she lay awake that night, listening to the prairie wind come under the window sash, thinking about the particular patience of a man who could stand in the street and talk a reluctant horse into cooperation without a single raised voice. She saw him again at the end of May when one of her older students, a 15-year-old girl named Rosa Guerrero, whose family had come up from Texas with a cattle drive 2 years earlier and stayed, did not appear at school for 4 days in a row. Louise went to find her. The Guerrero family worked a small parcel of land at the edge of a larger ranch, and when Louise rode out there on the horse she rented from the livery, a gentle brown mare named Biscuit, which was an undignified name but the horse deserved it, she found Rosa at home, keeping house while her mother was laid up with a broken ankle. Louise sat with Mrs. Guerrero for an hour, and she arranged with Rosa that the girl could come to school 3 mornings a week and do lessons to take home for the remaining days, and she left feeling the particular satisfaction of a problem bent toward a solution. On her way back to town, she took the slightly longer route along the creek bed because Biscuit was enjoying herself and Louise was in no great hurry, and she came around a stand of cottonwoods to find Clark Carver sitting on a gray roan horse, the same roan, or one very like it, at the edge of the water, looking out across the shallow creek with an expression that was purely private, not meant for anyone to see. He heard her coming before she was entirely around the cottonwoods and turned, and the expression cleared, and he said, "Miss Harper, I didn't know you rode." "I ride adequately," Louise said. "I wouldn't say I ride well." "Biscuit makes everyone look adequate," he said. "She's a forgiving animal. You know my horse. I know most of the horses in this county. It's a professional liability." He paused. "Are you lost or just riding?" "I was visiting the Guerrero family. Their girl missed school." Something shifted in his face, not admiration exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that recognized effort. "Rosa's mother broke her ankle, I heard. I sent one of my hands over with a bag of flour last week." Louise looked at him, this man sitting quiet beside a Kansas creek on a May afternoon, who had thought to send flour to a neighbor's family. "That was good of you," she said, and she meant it plainly. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the directness of that, which she found unexpectedly charming. "It wasn't much," he said. "It was enough," she said. "Those are sometimes the same thing." They rode back toward town together along the creek road, and the conversation moved the way good conversations move when 2 people are genuinely paying attention, not in a straight line but in a widening set of circles, touching one thing and then another, doubling back. He asked about her childhood, and she told him about growing up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a schoolteacher father, and a mother who had died when Louise was 12, leaving her to grow up in the reading and silence and competence way that fatherless, motherless children sometimes do. He told her about growing up on the Missouri ranch, the early mornings with his father, the particular loneliness of the frontier that is different from other loneliness because the sky is so large. She asked him about the loneliness, and he thought about it for a moment before answering, which she noticed. "It's the kind that's clean," he said finally, "if that makes sense. Out here the loneliness doesn't have other things mixed into it, Back east, I think, people are lonely in a crowd, and that's a different thing entirely. She thought about Gerald Ashworth's house in Cincinnati, full of people at parties, full of his colleagues and their wives, and herself in the middle of it feeling a particular variety of invisible that had nothing to do with actually being unseen. "Yes," she said, "I understand exactly what you mean." They reached the edge of town, and he tipped his hat and she rode on to the livery, and she did not turn to see if he watched her go. She did not need to. She could feel it. June passed and July began, and the Kansas summer arrived with the flat, uncompromising heat that the territory issued every year with the relentlessness of a bill collector. Louise propped the schoolhouse door open in the mornings and closed it by noon to keep the heat out, and she organized the children around the shaded north side of the building for their afternoon reading when the inside became genuinely unpleasant, and she worked her way through the summer session with the same steady, focused energy she had brought to everything since arriving. Clark Carver stopped by the schoolhouse one afternoon in mid-July on a pretext so thin it was practically transparent. He said he was in town for feed, and thought he might inquire whether the town council had addressed the window glass question. And Louise showed him the single cracked pane in the southeast corner that let in a draft in winter and a hornet in summer, and he looked at it for a moment and said, "I have a piece of glass from a broken cabinet door at the ranch that might fit that frame if we cut it right. I could bring it by Saturday if that's all right." "That would be very helpful," Louise said. "I'd need someone to hold the frame steady while I cut," he said. "I can do that," she said. He came on Saturday morning and brought the glass and a proper glazier's cutter, and he was careful and precise and patient, fitting the piece and recutting it twice, until the fit was right. And Louise held the frame steady and handed him tools when he asked, and they worked together in the quiet of the empty schoolhouse, with the late morning light coming through the good windows in wide, golden bars. And when they were done, he stood back and looked at the repaired pane and said, "That ought to hold through winter." "Thank you," Louise said, and the sincerity in her voice was entire and unguarded, because it was not only about the window. He looked at her then in the way he had started to look at her, directly and without the performance of indifference that a lot of men used when they were feeling something they weren't sure about, and he said, "Miss Harper, would you do me the honor of having supper with me some evening? Not at the social, not at a town event. Just supper." She had known it was coming, in the way you know a change in the weather before you can actually name the signs. She had spent 3 nights thinking about how she would answer it. She said, "I need to tell you something first." He waited, and the waiting was not impatient or wary, just present. She said, "I told Mrs. Pratt when I arrived that I was a widow. I am not. I am divorced. My husband, my former husband, was a man in Cincinnati who was not a kind man, and I left him legally, with full proceedings, and I came here because a teaching position in a small town was the first thing that presented itself, and I took a different name for my past than the true one because I thought it would be easier." She paused. She could feel her heart beating in a way that was not comfortable. "I am telling you this because I think you are an honest person, and I don't want to conduct a friendship, or anything further than a friendship, on a false foundation." The silence after she finished lasted perhaps 10 seconds, which felt considerably longer. Clark Carver said, "Miss Harper." She waited. "I came to this territory with a lie of my own," he said. "When I arrived 3 years ago to take over my father's ranch, I told people here that I had been managing a spread of my own in Missouri for 5 years. That was not true. I had been working a dry goods store in St. Joseph for 2 years and failing at it, and before that I had tried and left 2 separate ranching operations that I did not finish, and I was not certain I was capable of running my father's land, and I was frightened that if people knew that they would not extend me the credit I needed to keep the cattle alive through the first winter." He paused. "I have since made the ranch profitable. But I built the beginning of my reputation here on an inflated account of my experience, and I have known it, and I have not known what to do with knowing it." Louise looked at him for a long moment. The honesty of it, the direct, plain, offered honesty, given in exchange for hers, was one of the most disarming things any person had ever said to her. She said, "I think that makes us approximately even." Something in him released, she could see it, some held tension across his shoulders. "I think so too," he said. "So," Louise said, "supper." "Supper," he agreed. They went to supper that Friday evening at a small dining room attached to the Caldwell Hotel, run by a German woman named Mrs. Grubel, who made a beef roast that people came considerable distances to eat. Delapratte noticed them leaving together, and Louise knew by morning that the entirety of Caldwell would be aware of the event. But she found, to her own mild surprise, that she cared less than she had expected to. Over Mrs. Grubel's roast and her good brown bread, Louise and Clark talked for 2.5 hours with the ease of people who have already been through the difficult part and have arrived on the other side of it. He told her about his father, a quiet, strong-handed man who had loved the land with a religious intensity and passed that love to his son along with the debt on the cattle and the knowledge of how to read weather. She told him about her father in Philadelphia, the schoolteacher who had taught her that the only thing better than a good book was the look on a person's face when a difficult idea became suddenly clear to them. She told him, carefully and without excess detail, about Gerald Ashworth. She told him that Gerald had been charming at their introduction and steady in his erosion of that charm over 4 years of marriage. She told him about the long process of understanding that the life she was living was not going to improve on its own, about the legal proceedings that had cost her what remained of her reputation in Cincinnati and most of her small inheritance, about the decision to go west as the only direction that felt genuinely new. Clark listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "You did a brave thing." "I did a necessary thing," Louise said. "I am not certain those are the same." "I think sometimes they are," he said. "I think sometimes the necessary thing is the brave thing, and the only way you can see it is from the other side." She looked at him across the table with the candle between them and the night pressing against the window glass, and she thought that she had not felt this particular kind of scene in so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like, and the feeling was enormous and terrifying and wonderful in equal proportions. "You're a thoughtful man, Mr. Carver," she said. "Clark," he said. "Please." "Clark," she said, and saying his name felt like an agreement. The summer deepened and the courtship, because that was what it was, honestly and openly, in the way of two people who had decided to stop pretending, developed with a care and a pace that suited them both. He came by the schoolhouse on Saturday mornings when he was in town. She rode out to see the Guerrero girl on Tuesdays, and he began, with fine apparent coincidence, to be along the creek road on Tuesday afternoons. They had supper at Mrs. Grubel's twice more and once at the Alderman's, where Pete Alderman watched them with proprietary satisfaction, having apparently decided to take personal credit for their acquaintance. In August, he invited her to see the ranch. He came into town for her on a Sunday morning with a proper buggy, which she knew represented an effort, because he was generally a man on horseback. She wore a light cotton dress in a shade of warm brown and brought her good hat for the sun, and the drive out to the Carver spread was 6 miles of rolling short-grass prairie, with the morning sky immense and pale blue overhead, and the smell of dry grass and somewhere cattle, and the particular clean mineral scent of Kansas summer that she had come to associate with something resembling peace. The ranch was larger than she had pictured, a solid main house of weathered lumber and limestone, a good barn and a hay storage, a bunkhouse for the 4 hands he employed, several outbuildings in varying states of repair, and the lower acres he had put into wheat, which stood in neat rows, still green in August, promising a harvest. "The wheat is beautiful," she said, standing at the edge of the field with the wind moving it. "It's an argument," he said. "A lot of the cattle men think it's foolish to put any ground into grain, but the soil here is good, and the cattle market is going to fluctuate, and I'd rather have 2 things than one." "You think in terms of security," she said. "I think in terms of not losing what I have," he said, and the way he said it had a weight that she understood was not entirely about the wheat. He showed her the inside of the house, which was spare but not uncomfortable, a good stone fireplace in the main room, a kitchen with a proper cast-iron range, 2 bedrooms and a sitting room that held his father's books, which were numerous and well used. She spent 20 minutes looking at the books while he stood in the doorway and watched her look at them, and she pulled out a copy of Dickens' Bleak House, the spine creased to breaking with use, and said, "Your father read this." "Many times," Clark said. He thought Jarndyce and Jarndyce was a joke about cattle law. Louise laughed, and it was the real laugh, not the social one, and Clark Carver watched her laugh with an expression that he made no effort to disguise, and she saw it and felt the warmth of it move through her like sun on stone. They ate lunch that his housekeeper, a Tejana woman named Consuelo, had prepared, and after lunch they walked along the edge of the wheat field and then back along the creek that ran through the lower property. And the afternoon light was golden and full, and everything was easy between them in a way that Louise had not experienced with another person in so long that she kept waiting for it to become difficult, and it kept not doing so. At the end of the afternoon, standing by the buggy as the sun began to drop west, he said, "Louise." He had been using her first name for 3 weeks, and every time he said it she felt it as a small, distinct warmth. "I want to be plain with you about something." She turned to look at him. "All right. I have thought about you every day since the May social," he said. "I am not a man who says things like that easily, and I am not saying it to press you toward anything. I am saying it because you told me your truth and I told you mine, and I think the agreement we made that day in the schoolhouse was that we would keep doing that." She looked at him for a long moment, his serious, open face, the sage-green eyes, the afternoon light on his dark hair. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage in April with a lie and a leather trunk and a bruise going yellow at her wrist. She thought about how far that woman had walked from that stagecoach stop. She said, "I have thought about you every day too, Clark. I want you to know that." He stepped forward and took her hand, just her hand, holding it in both of his, and she let him. And they stood there in the golden Kansas afternoon with the wheat moving in the wind and the creek catching the light below them. And it was not yet a kiss, but it was the clear and certain precursor to one. And it was enough for the moment, which was its own kind of abundance. September brought the end of the summer session and the beginning of the fall term and the full Kansas harvest season, which meant that Clark Carver was consuming 19 hours of every day in the work of cutting wheat and finishing cattle for market, and Louise saw him less often, and the seeing him less often clarified things considerably. The absence of him was a particular shape. She noticed it the way you notice a piece of furniture moved from a room where it had always been. The space itself changed. She wrote him a letter, which she gave to Pete Alderman's boy when he came through town, and Clark wrote back in a clear, careful hand. He had not had much education, but he wrote the way he spoke, directly and without pretension, and the letters passed back and forth every week or so through September and into October, and they were not love letters in the formal sense, not flowery or excessive, but they were honest in a way that Louise found more intimate than floridity, because honesty always is. He came to town in the 3rd week of October for the supply run and the cattle market, and they had supper again at Mrs. Grubel's, and afterward he walked her back to Mrs. Connolly's boarding house, and they stood on the front step in the October cold with the stars bright and unreal above the prairie, and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to take your time answering." "All right," she said. "I know you came here to start over," he said. "I know a ranch is a particular kind of life and not what you grew up in, and I know I'm asking a lot. But I believe that what we have between us is real and worth building on, and I would very much like if you are willing to continue to move in the direction of something permanent." He paused. "I am not asking you yet. I want to be clear about that. I am asking if I may ask eventually." Louise stood in the cold October night and she thought about permanence and what it had meant before the house in Cincinnati, the slow, grinding loss of herself, and she thought about what it meant now, looking at this man who had offered her his true story in exchange for hers, who sent flour to broken-ankled neighbors, who talked horses out of bad behavior with patience and a quiet voice. She said, "Yes, Clark, you may ask." He smiled then, a full smile, not the pulled corner one, the real one, and she thought she would remember the sight of it for the rest of her life. He took her hands in his and leaned in and kissed her, there on the front step of Mrs. Connolly's boarding house in the October dark, and it was a careful and deliberate kiss, the kind that says this matters and I know it. And when it ended, she held on to his coat front for a moment, and he held her hands and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. That winter, Caldwell had its troubles, as frontier towns in 1878 and 1879 reliably did. The cattle trail brought its seasonal rough element drovers with several months' wages and a great deal of appetite for things that towns like Caldwell had learned to manage uneasily. The marshal, a capable man named Hendricks, kept the worst of it from becoming genuinely dangerous, but there were two notable fights at the saloon on the main street in November, and a fire at a livery on the north end in December that turned out to be accidental, but kept the whole town anxious for a week. Louise was not untouched by any of this. The schoolhouse was 3 blocks from the main saloon district, and on 2 occasions in November she had stayed late to work on lesson planning, and walked home through streets that had a particular energy after dark that she found unpleasant. She mentioned this to Clark in a letter, and he appeared in town within 2 days, not to make decisions for her but to walk the route with her in the early evening and assess it, as he put it, practically. "The issue is the alley between the feed merchant and the hardware," he said, walking it slowly. "There's no light there, and it's the obvious short way. If you take the street instead," he gestured to the longer boardwalk route, "it's 4 minutes more, but it's lit all the way." "I know," Louise said. "I have been taking the street route. I just mentioned it because," she paused, "because I wanted you to know, not to fix it, just to know." He looked at her. "Understood," he said, and the directness of his understanding was its own kind of comfort. He had a word with Marshal Hendricks about the after-dark lighting situation on the school side of town, and within the week, the marshal had gotten 2 of the town merchants to install oil lamps at the alley entrances, and when Louise mentioned in her next letter that the walk was improved, Clark wrote back only, "Good. I am glad." The winter was long and cold, as Kansas winters are, and Louise threw herself into the school with the full force of her energy. She organized an evening reading hour twice a week for adults, which drew a surprising number of people, ranching families who came in from the outskirts for supplies and stayed for the reading, cowpunchers who had more education than they showed, women who had gone years without access to anything that engaged their minds. She wrote to the state superintendent of public instruction in Topeka about additional funding for books, and received a response that was encouraging in a bureaucratic and not entirely satisfying way, but encouraging nonetheless. Rosa Guerrero, the 15-year-old from the Guerrero family, became something of a personal project. Rosa was quietly brilliant in a way that needed coaxing rather than directing. She absorbed language at a speed that Louise found remarkable, and her arithmetic was precise and inventive. Louise began giving her additional work and staying late twice a week to go over it with her. Rosa's father, Tomas Guerrero, was initially wary of this extra attention, not ungrateful, but wary in the specific way of a man whose family had learned to be cautious about what Anglo interest in them might mean. Louise met with him directly at his home, and they had a careful and honest conversation about what she saw in Rosa and what she thought it might lead to, and Tomas Guerrero listened and at the end said simply, "She is smarter than me. I have known it since she was 7. He paused. "Thank you for seeing it." It was not a small thing being seen accurately. Louise knew that better than most. Clark came to town in January for the county meeting about the spring cattle market, and they had 3 evenings together, and on the last of those evenings, sitting in the small parlor of Mrs. Connolly's boarding house that Mrs. Connolly allowed her good tenants to use on winter evenings. With a coal fire going and a cold wind at the window, he said, "I want to ask you that question now if you're willing to hear it." Louise set down her tea. "I'm willing," she said. He set down his coffee. He looked at her with those sage-green eyes, and he did not look nervous, which she respected. He looked decided, which was different and better. He said, "Louise Harper, I love you. I have loved you since the day you told me your truth in the schoolhouse, and I told you mine, because I knew then that you were a woman I could build something honest with, and that is what I want more than anything else. I want to build something honest with you. I want you at the ranch with me, and I want to work the land with you and sit across from you at supper and argue about Dickens and go to sleep knowing you are there." He paused. "I know the ranch is not what you came from, and I know it is hard work. I know you have things of your own to do, and I would not ask you to give them up. The school matters. You matter in this town. I want to support that." He paused again. "Will you marry me?" Louise sat in the firelight with her tea going cool beside her, and she thought, briefly and completely, about every road that had led to this room, this fire, this man. The Cincinnati house and the bruised wrist and the stagecoach and the dusty Caldwell Street and the window glass and the creek road, and the first supper at Mrs. Grubel's and the October kiss and the letters and the winter evenings and the slow, sure, deliberate construction of something real. She said, "Yes, Clark, I will marry you." He reached across and took both her hands, and she could feel the warmth of his grip all the way up to her shoulders, and the coal fire popped in the grate, and the wind went by outside, and everything was just exactly as it should be. They were married in April of 1879, exactly 1 year after Louise had stepped off the stage in Caldwell, and the wedding was held in the church, officiated by the minister Reverend Cartwright, and attended by what felt like the entirety of Caldwell and a good portion of the surrounding county. Della Pratt cried with a full-hearted enthusiasm that she made no effort to conceal. Pete Alderman shook Clark's hand for what seemed like a full minute. Rosa Guerrero, invited as a guest of honor because Louise had wanted her there, sat in the third row in her best dress and watched with dark, attentive eyes that held a bright private satisfaction. The dress Louise wore was ivory cotton with a lace collar that Della had helped her order from a shop in Wichita, and she carried wild prairie flowers that she had gathered herself that morning, because she was not, at 27 years old in her second life on the Kansas frontier, going to stand on ceremony about everything. She walked down the aisle of the small church with her own 2 feet and her head level and her eyes on Clark Carver, who was standing at the front in a clean dark coat and his battered hat, because she had told him the hat was part of him, and she was marrying all of him. And the look on his face when she walked toward him was the same look she had first seen in the golden light of the ranch sitting room when she had laughed at the Dickens joke, open and unguarded and entirely real. The look of a man who is not performing anything. Reverend Cartwright read the words. Clark said "I do" in a clear, steady voice. Louise said "I do" in a voice that was equally steady and somewhat warmer. Clark put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band, chosen together from the jeweler in Wichita, and the church smelled of spring and candle smoke and the particular dusty sweetness of frontier Kansas in April. And when the minister said he could kiss his bride, Clark did so with the same careful deliberateness he brought to all things that mattered, and Mrs. Della Pratt produced a sound from the third row that was equal parts sob and cheer. The celebration after the ceremony was held in the cleared space behind the church, with food contributed by what seemed like every household in the county. Consuelo from the ranch had made tamales that created a quiet sensation among people who had never eaten them before, and Mrs. Grubel sent her best bread, and Pete Alderman's wife Alina made 3 pies, and Amos Birch played his fiddle with a joy that improved even the 3 songs he did not play particularly well. They danced. Louise had not danced in years. Gerald Ashworth had used social events as exhibitions, and she had forgotten that dancing could simply be joyful. And Clark was not the most elegant dancer she had ever known, but he was present and careful, and she fit against him in a way that felt architectural, as though two structures had found their shared wall. They left Caldwell in the late afternoon in the buggy, and the drive back to the ranch was the same drive she had made in August, the same rolling short-grass prairie, the same enormous sky, now deepening toward evening, but entirely different in every way that mattered. The ranch in the last light of an April evening was the most beautiful thing Louise had seen since coming west. The limestone house with the new garden bed she had helped plan in March, the wheat in its early green rise in the lower field, the horses moving in the pasture, the wide sky going rose and gold above it. She stood beside the buggy and looked at it and felt the strange, full weight of a life that was hers, that she had chosen and built, and that was real. Clark stood beside her and said, "Home," simply, and she said, "Yes," and that was all that was necessary. They settled into the life of the ranch together with the same pragmatic care they had brought to everything else, and Louise found that ranch life suited her in ways she had not entirely predicted. She kept the school, negotiating with the town council for a half-year contract that allowed her to return to the ranch in the full winter months when the roads were difficult anyway. And the council, recognizing that a schoolteacher of her quality was not easy to find and replace, agreed. She rode to town on the teaching days on a better horse than Biscuit, a steady bay gelding Clark picked out for her at the Wichita market in May, and she came home in the evenings to the ranch and to him. The physical shape of their life together was not without its adjustments. She was not a natural farmer's wife in all respects. She burned the bread occasionally in the cast-iron range, which had a disposition of its own, and she found the first summers canning laborious in a way she had not anticipated. But she learned with the same focused, honest attention she brought to teaching, and Consuelo, who came 3 days a week to cook and clean, taught her the range's particular moods with a patience that Louise found genuinely touching. Clark, for his part, learned to leave his boots by the door and to warn her when he was expecting hands at the house for meals. And he read the books she brought home from the school library with genuine interest and discussed them with her in the evenings. And he listened when she talked about Rosa Guerrero or the school board's latest bureaucratic complication. And he never once made her feel that these things were secondary to the ranch simply because they were not the ranch. In June of 1879, 2 months after the wedding, the Guerrero family situation became briefly complicated in a way that required Clark's involvement more than Louise had expected. Tomás Guerrero came to her at school on a Tuesday morning looking tight-faced and careful, and he told her that the owner of the land the Guerrero family worked, a man named Aldridge who ran several hundred acres northeast of town and rented smaller parcels to working families, was requiring an increase in their lease payment that the family could not meet. It was not an unusual situation in the territory at the time. The land arrangements around Caldwell were frequently exploitative of families like the Guerreros, who had limited legal recourse and fewer allies than white settlers, and Tomás knew it and Louise knew it. She talked to Clark that evening. He was quiet for a while, looking at the fire, and then he said, "Aldridge is looking to consolidate. He's been doing it to 3 or 4 families along that stretch." He paused. "I have 2 parcels of my lower land that border the creek and that I've been thinking of putting into grass for grazing. If the Guerreros wanted to work that land on a fair share arrangement, not a lease, a proper share arrangement where they build equity, that would get them off Aldridge's property." Louise looked at him. "You would do that? It's good for the ranch to have capable people working the land," he said, "and it's the right thing. Those are not always separate reasons." Tomás Guerrero, when Louise brought the offer to him carefully and without pressure, was quiet for a long time. He looked at her and then he said, "Why does he offer this?" "Because it is practical and because it is just," Louise said. "Both things." Tomás looked out toward the prairie. The injustice of how his family had been managed by landowners in Texas and Kansas for years was a specific and acknowledged thing between them. They had spoken of it before, carefully and directly. He understood the difference between charity that condescended and a fair arrangement that acknowledged his family's value. He asked to see the terms written out, and Clark wrote them out that week, having Louise read them twice to ensure they were clear, and Tomás Guerrero signed them in May of 1880, and the family moved to the Carver land's lower parcel in June. Rosa Guerrero, meanwhile, at 16, was making Louise begin to think seriously about what happened after Caldwell's one-room school ran out of things to teach her. The summer of 1879 was long and productive, and for Louise, who had spent the previous several years bracing against things, the experience of a summer that simply was warm days and hard work and easy evenings with a man she loved in a house that was hers, was so different from everything that had come before that she sometimes felt as though she were living someone else's life, someone luckier and more deserving. Clark watched her one evening in late July. She was on the front porch with a book, the sun going down behind the wheat field, the air still and warm, and he said, "You look surprised." She looked up. "By what?" "By being happy," he said. He sat down in the other chair, and he did not say it critically, just observationally, the way he said most things. She thought about it honestly. "I think I am a little," she said. "I think I had stopped assuming it was available to me." He reached over and took her hand. "It is available to you," he said. "It's here, it's yours." She turned her hand in his and held on. "I know," she said. "I'm learning it." In August of 1879, Louise realized she was pregnant. She told Clark on a Sunday morning while he was at the kitchen table drinking coffee and reading the Wichita Eagle, which they received 2 days late but read with commitment. She said, "Clark," and he looked up, and she said, "I think we're going to have a child." He set the newspaper down. He looked at her with an expression that went through several things rapidly: surprise, certainty, wonder, and then settled into the same quiet, decided look he used when something important was confirmed. He said, "Are you all right?" "I'm very well," she said. Yes, I'm very well." He stood up and crossed to her and put both hands on her face very gently and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and he said against her hair, "Good. That's good, Louise." She pressed her face against his shoulder and said, "I didn't know I wanted this until right now." "Neither did I," he said, "but we do." She continued teaching through the fall, which caused one member of the school board, a man named Hadwick, to suggest that it was perhaps unsuitable, and Louise met this suggestion with a patience that was entirely superficial over a bedrock of complete inflexibility. And she taught through October and November and into December, when she arranged for the school to be covered by an older student for the final weeks before the holiday, and she went home to the ranch to wait. Their son was born in March of 1880, during a late-season snow that turned the prairie white and silent. He was born with Clark's dark hair and what would eventually prove to be Louise's gray eyes, and he arrived after a long night attended by Mrs. Connolly, who had brought 3 children into the world herself and 2 others since arriving in Caldwell. And when she put him in Louise's arms, he was red and furious and entirely real, and Louise held him and looked at Clark, who was sitting on the edge of the bed in his shirt sleeves with the expression of a man who has been completely undone by something wonderful. "What do we call him?" Clark said. Louise looked at the child's face, his loud, insistent, brand-new face. She said, "James." "James Carver," Clark said, tasting it. "James Horace Carver," he added for his father. "James Horace Carver," Louise agreed. Clark took the boy with the careful confidence of a man accustomed to handling animals of all sizes, though considerably more tender than he had ever been with any of them, and he sat with his son in the chair by the window while the snow came down outside and Louise slept. And in the morning, when the snow had stopped and the world was white and clean and quiet, he looked out the window with the baby in his arms, and he felt the full weight and rightness of a life that was his own making. The spring of 1880 was transformative in several directions at once, which was the nature of life on the frontier, where nothing moved slowly for long. The Guerrero family was settled well on the lower Carver parcel, and Tomás Guerrero proved to be an excellent farmer, more methodical than Clark in some respects, with a different range of knowledge about soil and water that the land responded to well. They worked together through the spring planting in a way that was practical and mutual, and Clark told Louise one evening that Tomás Guerrero was the best judge of land health he had ever seen, and Louise said, "Then tell him that," and Clark did, the next day directly. Rosa Guerrero turned 17 in April of 1880. Louise had written, over the course of the winter, to the State Normal School in Emporia, which trained teachers, and she had written on Rosa's behalf with a specificity and a conviction that she brought to few other written communications. She had included examples of Rosa's work translations she had done from Spanish to English, mathematical problems she had invented and solved, an essay Rosa had written about the Kansas sky that had moved Louise to genuine tears. She had been careful and strategic in how she framed it, knowing that the institution's willingness to consider Rosa would be complicated by prejudice that operated like weather, everywhere and given as natural. And she had asked Tomás's permission before writing and Clark's advice on the letter and Della Pratt's advice on the person it should be addressed to at the institution. In June of 1880, a letter arrived at the Carver Ranch addressed to Miss Rosa Guerrero, care of Mrs. Louise Carver, and it contained an offer of a 2-year teaching certificate program at Emporia Normal School beginning in September, with a partial scholarship funded by a women's education organization in Topeka. Louise rode to the Guerrero parcel with the letter and gave it to Rosa in person. Rosa read it once. She looked up. She read it again. Her face did something complicated and tremendous, and then she said very quietly, "This is real. This is real," Louise said. Rosa pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes for a moment, and Louise watched her and felt the particular joy of a teacher at the moment a student steps through a door that the teacher helped open, which is one of the best feelings available to human beings. Tomás Guerrero read the letter when Rosa gave it to him, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said to Louise, "You did this." "Rosa did this," Louise said. "I only made the case for what she already was." Tomás looked at her with eyes that held something larger than gratitude, something that was about all the years of his family's invisible labor and underestimated worth, and he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Carver, thank you." The summer of 1880 was a season of heat and hard work, and the particular fullness that comes to a life that has found its right dimensions. James Carver, at 5 months, was a cheerful and substantial baby who regarded the world with Clark's quiet watchfulness and his mother's tendency to focus with ferocious intensity on whatever was directly in front of him. He went to the schoolhouse in the fall when Louise returned to teaching, sleeping in a basket beside her desk, which the children regarded as a delightful addition to the school, and which the one resistant school board member could not argue with because the other 4 members thought it was perfectly sensible. Clark's wheat harvest in the fall of 1880 was the best the Lower Acres had ever produced, and combined with a solid cattle run to the Wichita market, it made the Carver Ranch financially stable in a way that felt, for the first time, genuinely secure rather than provisionally holding. Clark sat at the kitchen table one October night with the ledger book open in front of him and Louise beside him with James asleep against her shoulder, and he went through the numbers in his careful way, and at the end he closed the book and said, "We're all right, Louise. We're genuinely all right." She put her free hand over his on the closed ledger. "I know," she said. "I've known it for a while." He looked at her. "So have I," he said. "I just needed to see it in the numbers." She smiled. "That's very like you. Is it a complaint?" "It is the opposite of a complaint," she said. They sat in the kitchen with the fall wind outside and the sleeping baby between them and the warm lamp on the table, and Louise thought about lying and truth and territories, and what it meant to stay, to choose, actively and daily, to remain in a place and a life because it was genuinely yours. She thought about the woman on the stagecoach, practicing a small lie in the rattling dark. She thought about the bruised wrist and the divorce papers and the brass handle of the trunk that had held everything she owned. She thought about the moment in the schoolhouse when she had offered her truth to a man with green eyes who had offered his back, and how that exchange, that mutual laying down of false accounts, had been the beginning of something that had grown into everything around her. The kitchen, the wheat field, the baby's warm weight, the hand under hers. The lie had brought her here, but it was the truth that had let her stay. She looked at Clark, who was looking at the closed ledger with the expression of a man at rest, and she said, "Clark." He looked up. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know I say that as someone who has looked at it very carefully and is very certain." He looked at her for a moment with the full, unguarded face he kept for her, and he said, "I love you, Louise," with exactly that same certainty. He leaned over and kissed her gently, and James stirred against her shoulder and made a small noise of mild displeasure at the movement, and they both looked at him, and then at each other, and the laughter that came out of them both was soft and full and entirely real. Rosa Guerrero left for Emporia in September of 1880 in a dress Louise had helped her make, with a leather satchel of books and a letter of recommendation from the Caldwell School Board and a second one, unofficial, from Louise herself, addressed to the head of the normal school program. Tomás and his wife, Maria, drove her to Caldwell for the stage, and Louise and Clark came to see her off, and Clark pressed a small amount of money into Tomás's hands and said it was for Rosa's first-term supplies, and Tomás started to object, and Clark said, "She is going to come back here with a certificate and teach school, and our children are going to be in her class. This is a practical investment," and Tomás Guerrero shook his hand with the gravity of a man receiving something he has worked a long time to deserve. Rosa embraced Louise on the stage platform, and Louise held her for a moment and said quietly, "You deserve this, every piece of it. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." Rosa pulled back and looked at her with those dark, bright eyes. She said, "You will be here when I come back." "I will be right here," Louise said. The stage pulled out and they watched it go down the main street of Caldwell and turn south onto the road toward Wichita. And Louise stood on the platform with her hand in Clark's and watched until it was out of sight. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was the hardest winter the territory had seen in several years. A series of blizzards that began in December and ran through February with a relentlessness that tested every ranch operation in the county. The cattle lost weight they could not spare. The wheat in the fields lay buried and still, and whether it would emerge in spring was uncertain. The Carver ranch battened down with a seriousness that Clark managed quietly and Louise matched with a steady, practical calm that was its own kind of partnership. They were not idle. There was feeding to be done, and fences to be checked, and the stock to be watched. And Clark and his 4 hands, good men, all of them, who Clark treated with a fairness that kept them loyal in difficult times, worked through the blizzard weeks with the patient, unflagging effort of people who understand that the land does not adjust itself to human convenience. Louise kept James warm and safe, and she turned her enforced indoor time into a productive fury of lesson planning and letter writing, and in the long dark evenings, the teaching of Clark's ranch hand Emmett, a 22-year-old Tennessean who had a fine mind and had never been formally educated, to read. Emmett had asked her shyly in October if she ever took adult students outside of school hours, and she had said that she did, and by February, he was reading the Wichita Eagle independently and considerably faster than Clark, who teased him about it in a way that made Emmett glow with pride. The personal satisfaction Louise took in this was identical to what she had felt with every student she had ever moved forward, and it confirmed for her something she had known since childhood but been afraid to say plainly in the Cincinnati years. That teaching was not what she did in the absence of something better. It was what she was, as specifically and honestly as Clark was a rancher, and the combining of these two things into one shared life was not a compromise. It was a completion. In March of 1881, the wheat emerged. It came up through the mud of the snowmelt with the particular stubborn green insistence of a thing that has been waiting and has decided it has waited long enough. And Clark stood at the edge of the lower field and looked at it for a long time with his hat in his hands, and Louise stood beside him with James on her hip, and neither of them said anything because some things do not require words. The spring of 1881 was deeply and completely good. The cattle were in good shape. The wheat was up. The Guerrero parcel was producing well, and Tomás had asked Clark in March about the possibility of expanding their share arrangement to include a second small field, which Clark agreed to immediately, and then spent an evening with Louise working out the terms to ensure they remained genuinely equitable. Louise was pregnant again, which she had confirmed in February and told Clark on a Sunday morning in the same kitchen where she had told him about James, and he had reacted with the same layered, certain wonder, reaching for her with both hands and holding her face and saying, "Good, Louise, that is good," in a voice that was slightly rougher than he intended. She taught through the spring and into the early summer, arranging for coverage again as the fall approached. Their second child, a girl, was born in October of 1881, in the room above the sitting room where Clark's father's books still lived on their worn shelves, and she came into the world with less drama than James had, and with her mother's gray eyes immediately apparent, and they named her Mee after Clark's mother, who had died before he had come to Kansas, and Aliner for Pete Alderman's wife, who had been a friend to them both. Mee Clark Carver was a small, decisive person from the first hour. James, who was 19 months old and had the careful watchfulness of a child raised among attentive adults, came to look at her with the solemn gravity of an elder statesman assessing a new colleague. And then he put his small hand very gently on her blanket, and that was the establishment of a bond that would grow and develop for the rest of both their lives. Clark held me in the chair by the window as he had held James, looking out at the October ranch, and Louise watched him from the bed and thought that the face of a good man holding his child was one of the most quietly magnificent sights available in any era or place. "She has your eyes," Clark said without looking away from me. "She has your chin," Louise said. "I hope not," he said. "It's a very stubborn chin." "You say that as though it's a criticism," Louise said. "I have always found your chin an asset." He looked at her across the room with the pulled corner smile and the warmth in his sage-green eyes, and Louise pressed back against her pillow and felt the full, round, sun-warmed weight of a life that was real and chosen and hers. Rosa Guerrero came home to Caldwell in the summer of 1882 with her teaching certificate, which she had earned in the top quarter of her program class, and a quiet, steady confidence that was the same quality she had always had but larger now, inhabiting more space. She came to the ranch first before she went anywhere else, and she sat in the kitchen with Louise and me in her arms and James at the table, eating a piece of Consulo's cornbread with the focused dedication of a 2-year-old. And Rosa looked around at all of it, the kitchen, the baby, the boy, the house with its books and its cast-iron range and its worn, solid furniture, and she said to Louise, "You built a real thing here." "We did," Louise said. "Clark and I, yes." Rosa looked at her. "Are you happy?" Louise considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see Clark at the fence line of the far pasture, talking to Tomás Guerrero about something to do with the lower field. The light was summer afternoon gold, and the sky was the clear deep blue that Kansas sky becomes in July, and James was demolishing his cornbread, and Mee was tucking her face against Rosa's shoulder with her decisive, proprietary way. "Yes," Louise said. "I am very happy." Rosa said, "Good," in a voice that held the whole weight of what it meant specifically, for a woman to have built a happy life by her own effort and honest reckoning, against the considerable odds that the world routinely offered women for the purpose of discouragement. Rosa was offered the Caldwell school position in August, when Louise formally resigned it. Louise had arranged this too, over the course of the spring, had spoken to the school board, had made the case, had again been specific and direct and strategically patient. The board had some hesitation, and Louise had addressed each hesitation plainly, and without the anxiety that she might have brought to such a conversation in earlier years. And by July, the hesitation had been resolved, and Rosa Guerrero was appointed as the new schoolteacher of Caldwell, Kansas, at 21 years old. The day Rosa taught her first class, Louise rode to the edge of town and looked at the schoolhouse, the same raw lumber building, though now with proper window glass in every frame and a new stove, and benches that Clark had helped build the previous autumn, and she felt the particular pride of handing something over well. She did not go in. Rosa did not need her in the room. She turned her horse back toward the ranch and rode home through the September morning under the enormous sky. She was 30 years old. She had been in Caldwell for 4.5 years. She was Louise Carver now, not Louise Harper the widow, not Louise Harper the divorcee with the document in the trunk lining. She was Louise Harper Carver, wife and mother and former schoolteacher and reader and woman of the frontier, and the truth of who she was had been assembled piece by piece from what she had chosen to do and say and offer and stay. The trunk was still in the bedroom wardrobe. She had never thrown it out because she was not sentimental about objects, but she was honest about histories. The divorce papers were in it, and the old blue traveling dress, and a letter her father had written her when she left for Cincinnati that she still read sometimes in the winter evenings when the fire was good, and Clark was reading across from her, and the children were asleep, because her father had been a thoughtful man who understood that his daughter was more than anyone was giving her credit for, and the letter said so, and some things need to be kept. In the spring of 1883, the Carver Ranch had its best year. The wheat harvest, combined with the cattle run and the Guerrero share arrangement, made the operation genuinely profitable for the first time in its history, which Clark announced to Louise over the ledger in October with the same careful, confirmed certainty he brought to all things, and which Louise received with the same warmth. They had a third child, another son, born in December of 1883, named Thomas William Carver, Thomas for Tomás Guerrero and William for Louise's father. Tommy, as he was immediately called by his siblings, was a loud and enthusiastic presence from the first, and James regarded him with a 3-year-old's magnanimous toleration, and me, at 2, was simply delighted, patting Tommy's face with a confidence that was the origin of a lifelong dynamic. The house, which Clark had extended in 1882 with a proper second bedroom added onto the back, was full in the way that a house should be, not crowded, but inhabited, warm with people and their ongoing lives. The territory was changing around them. Kansas was not the raw frontier town it had been in 1878. Caldwell was a working town now with a proper hotel and 2 dry goods stores and a bank, and a school that was producing literate citizens. And the cattle trail through town was becoming more regulated, and the rough seasonal element less dominant. The railroad had reached Caldwell in 1880 and changed the cattle economy considerably, making the drive less central and the town more connected to the wider commerce of the country, which was itself changing rapidly. Clark watched these changes with the measured attention of a man who had bet his life on this land and intended to continue winning that bet. He adapted, added more wheat acreage, diversified the cattle breeding, considered and decided against a mining venture a man from Wichita tried to interest him in, decided in favor of putting a proper well system in that would serve both the main ranch and the Guerrero parcel more reliably. Louise watched the changes with the interest of a woman who had always been paying attention to the shape of things. She wrote to the state superintendent of public instruction again in 1883, this time on behalf of a broader agenda, arguing for a county-wide school funding structure that would ensure the kind of stability that individual town charity could not, and for the inclusion of Spanish-speaking children in the curriculum rather than their systematic exclusion, which was common practice in many county schools. She received a more substantive response this time, and it was the beginning of a correspondence that would, over several years, contribute to actual policy change in the way such things change slowly, grudgingly, in increments, but genuinely. She was not naive about the pace of change or the depth of the injustice it was working against. She had seen what the frontier did to families like the Guerreros, the casual exploitation, the legal vulnerability, the way that their labor was visible and their humanity was not. She could not fix that alone, and she did not pretend to. But she worked at what she could reach, and she was specific and persistent about it. And Clark supported this work with the same uncomplicated, practical support he brought to all her endeavors. One evening in the fall of 1883, he said, "You know that what you're doing, the letters, the school board arguments, the work with Rose's students, it matters more than the wheat." Louise looked up from her letter. "That's a large claim from a man who loves his wheat." "The wheat feeds bodies," he said. "What you're doing feeds the other thing." She looked at him, this rancher with his sage-green eyes and his worn hat and his careful, honest heart, and she said, "I think you may be the best person I know, Clark Carver." He looked uncomfortable in the way he always did with direct praise, and she loved him for it. He said, "I've had good instruction." She threw a small piece of crumpled paper at him, and he caught it, and they both laughed. And from upstairs came the sound of James waking from a bad dream, and Louise put down her pen, and Clark said, "I'll go," and went upstairs, and Louise sat alone in the kitchen for a moment in the warm lamplight, listening to the sound of Clark's low voice and James's settling, and the house around her was full of everything she had built and chosen and stayed for. She picked up her pen. She thought about the woman in the stagecoach, practicing her lie in the dark. She thought about the woman who had stood in the Kansas dust with a trunk and told a falsehood to a kind postmistress, and how that woman had been frightened and exhausted, and doing the only thing she knew how to do, which was survive. She did not blame her. She had not stopped being her. She had simply grown larger than the lie, in the way that real people grow larger than the versions of themselves that get them through the worst of things. She thought about Clark, who had built his early reputation here on an inflated account of himself because he had been frightened too, because the land was enormous and the debt was real, and the fear of failing in front of people who were watching was its own particular weight. She thought about how they had found each other, not in spite of their false starts, but because of what they had done with them, because the honesty they had chosen to offer each other had been a specific, deliberate thing, chosen over the easier path of continued performance. Two people who had come to the same territory with lies. Two people who had stayed with the truth. And that was how they had found each other. Not despite all of it, but through it, through the exact, difficult, honest passage that the territory had required of both of them, through the stripping away of false accounts, until what remained was real and workable and worth building. She finished her letter to the state superintendent and folded it and set it with the Morning Post, and she blew out the kitchen lamp and went upstairs. And Clark was still in the children's room, sitting on the edge of James's bed in the dark, and she stood in the doorway and listened. And James had gone back to sleep, and Clark was sitting there in the quiet just watching his son breathe in the way that parents do when the child is small and the world is large and the fact of the child's existence still has not quite become ordinary. She said softly, "Come to bed." He turned. He stood. He came to her in the doorway, and she took his hand, and they went down the hall together, and the house was quiet around them, and the Kansas night was full of stars, and everything that had been broken was healed, and everything that had been uncertain was resolved, and the life they were living was the life they had built, truth by truth, hand in hand, on the wide and honest ground of the territory they had both come to with lies and stayed to love. The years that followed moved with the rhythm of a life lived well, full of work and weather, and the ongoing, ordinary drama of children growing, of land changing, of a territory becoming a state, which Kansas was, having achieved statehood well before their arrival, and of the country itself continuing the enormous, complicated project of its own becoming. Clark taught James to ride at 4, and to read a fence line at 5, and to love the land with the same religious, practical love that Horace Carver had passed to him. James was a quiet, serious boy with his mother's gray eyes and his father's patience, and by the time he was 7, it was clear that the ranch was in his bones the same way it was in Clark's. Miss Carver was incandescent. She had her mother's directness and her father's stillness, in a combination that made her capable of standing absolutely quiet, and then saying something that ended an argument or opened a door. And Louise watched her with the particular delight of a parent who recognizes a quality they have tried to cultivate coming up fully formed in a child who did not need cultivating. Me started sitting in on Rosa Guerrero's school at 6, and Rosa, who had become by 1884 one of the finest schoolteachers in the county, wrote Louise a note that said simply, "Your daughter is going to be extraordinary. You are forewarned." Tommy was a joy and a handful, and deeply devoted to animals in a way that Clark indulged with the helpless generosity of a man who cannot bring himself to say no to a child who loves the same things he does. By the age of 4, Tommy had 3 dogs, a large toad he had named Governor, and a compelling argument conducted entirely in feeling rather than reason for a second horse. Rosa Guerrero, at 22, met and began a careful courtship with a young man named Daniel Reyes, who had come from New Mexico to work on a ranch outside of Caldwell, and who was, by all available evidence, genuinely worthy of her, which Clark assessed with a rancher's practical directness and Louise assessed with a teacher's reading of character, and they arrived at the same conclusion independently, and confirmed it together over supper one evening in the early fall of 1883. Daniel Reyes and Rosa Guerrero were married in the spring of 1884 in Caldwell, and Louise was there in the church in her good dress, holding me on her hip with Clark beside her, and James serious and responsible beside Clark, and she watched Rosa walk toward Daniel with the full, level confidence of a woman who knows exactly who she is, and Louise felt the same round, sun-warmed weight in her chest that she associated with all the best things. The feeling of something real and good and genuinely earned. Tomás Guerrero, walking his daughter to her husband, caught Louise's eye across the church, and he nodded once, with the gravity of a man who does not use words when a nod will do, and Louise nodded back, and everything that needed to be said between them was said in that exchange. The year James turned 10 and me turned 8 and Tommy turned 6, the Carver Ranch was the most productive operation in the county, and Clark Carver had been asked by 3 separate men to run for the county commissioner seat, which he considered for several evenings in the kitchen with Louise and eventually declined, saying that he thought other men were better suited to it, and that what he did on the land, and with the people who worked it, was its own form of contribution. Louise agreed with his conclusion and told him so, and they spent the evening instead planning the expansion of the Guerrero parcel arrangement to include Tomás's son Miguel, who at 18 was shaping up to be as fine a farmer as his father. The Caldwell school under Rosa was producing children who could read and reason and ask questions, and Louise's correspondence with the state superintendent had resulted in a modest but real increase in county school funding, and the official inclusion of bilingual instruction guidelines for districts with significant Spanish-speaking populations, which was not the complete justice the situation called for, but was a step in the right direction, and Louise kept writing. She kept writing because the work was not done, and because her father had taught her that the measure of a person was not what they did when it was easy, but what they kept doing when the progress was slow, and because she was Louise Carver, who had come to this territory with a lie and stayed with the truth, and the truth required continuing. Clark came in from the fields one October evening in 1885, when the children were in bed and the harvest was done and the house was quiet and the lamp was lit in the kitchen window, and he came in with the smell of cold air and dry grass and he stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her, and she looked up from her letter, and he said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me," she said. "I think about the first time I saw you," he said. "On the boardwalk watching me argue with that horse." Louise smiled. "You weren't arguing, you were being patient. She was a very unreasonable horse. You were patient with her anyway." He came to the table and sat across from her. "I think about how I did not know then," he said. "How I had no idea yet what was about to happen." Louise looked at him across the table, this man she had chosen and been chosen by, whose lie and truth had made him as capable of finding her as she had been of finding him. She thought about the enormous unlikeliness of it, two frightened, imperfectly honest people stumbling toward each other in the dust of a Kansas town and having the sense and the courage, eventually, to offer each other the true thing instead of the easy one. She said, "I didn't know either, but I think I hoped." "From the boardwalk." "From the boardwalk," she said. "A man that patient with a horse is worth watching." Clark laughed, and the sound of it filled the kitchen the way good laughter fills a room that has been built for it. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together in the warm lamplight of their Kansas kitchen, with the October night at the windows and the sleeping children upstairs and the land outside that was theirs and worked and honest. And the lie was long behind them both, and the truth was everything around them, and it was more than enough. It was abundance. It was exactly, precisely, irreversibly home. In the years that came after, and they were good years, steady years, the kind of years that a life built on real foundations produces, the Carver family grew in all the ways that lives grow when they are given proper room. James became, by the time he was 12, the most capable young hand on the ranch, rising before dawn with his father and learning the language of soil and weather, an animal with the seriousness of a student who understands that his classroom is the living world. Me became, by the time she was 10, the most interesting person in any room she occupied, and both Rosa and Louise began to set aside certain books for her, the way you stake a garden for a plant that is going to outgrow its first bed. Tommy, who loved every creature on the earth with a democratic and inexhaustible enthusiasm, persuaded Clark to let him apprentice with the veterinarian who came through Caldwell quarterly. And by the time Tommy was 8, he had a collection of knowledge about animal medicine that was larger than most adults in the county. Clark turned 37 in 1886 and Louise turned 34. And on the evening of her birthday, he brought her to the edge of the lower wheat field at sunset, and they stood where they had stood in the first summer of their marriage and watched the light go gold, and then rose, and then the deep, pure dark of a Kansas sky clearing toward night. And he said nothing except to take her hand, and she needed nothing except that. She had come to this territory with a lie. He had done the same. And in the doing and the undoing of those lies, in the offering of truth to each other in a raw lumber schoolhouse in the spring of 1878, they had found each other, and found themselves, and found the life that was possible when two people decide that honesty is not a policy but a foundation, not a virtue practiced occasionally, but a way of being present to each other every single day. The stars came out above the Kansas prairie, enormous and uncountable, the same stars that had been there before the territory and would be there after everything they had built had returned to the earth. And Louise Carver stood on the ground she had chosen and held the hand of the man she had chosen it with. And she was grateful fully, specifically, entirely grateful, not for the easy path which had never been available, but for the true one. The one she had been building, step by step, truth by truth, since the moment she had opened her mouth in a Kansas schoolhouse and stopped lying. The moon rose. Clark put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way she had been leaning into him for 7 years, with the trust of a woman who has tested the thing she is leaning on and found it holds. Behind them, up the rise, the lights of the farmhouse were warm in the dark, and inside, in the good house they had built together, 3 children were sleeping their strong, unknowing sleep, full of the future that their parents had made possible by being, finally and at great cost and with great reward, honest. Everything was well, Everything was theirs. The territory had asked for the truth, and they had given it, and it had given them everything in return.